Good evening from London and the start of a new series. Our audience here ready to question and argue with our panel. Welcome to Question Time. And as always, a big welcome to our audience here, a cross-section of political opinion in Britain. And to our panel, the International Development Secretary, Justine Greening, Labour's Shadow Business Secretary, Chuka Umunna, the Green Party MP, Caroline Lucas, the Times columnist, David Aaronovitch, and the law professor and former State Department advisor under George W. Bush, Colleen Graffy. And of course, the questions all come from our audience, who are here to debate with our panel. They don't come from us. And the first one comes from Jane Eagles, please. Jane Eagles.
Has Britain shirked its global responsibility by failing to militarily intervene in Syria?
Has Britain shirked its global responsibility? David Aaronovitch.
Yes, I think it has. I think that this civil war in Syria started in March 2011 with demonstrations by Democrats that were shot upon by the Syrian government of Assad. They then took up arms. At that stage there was no talk of Al-Qaeda. There has since then been a gradual decline into civil war as a result of nobody doing anything about it. 100,000 people have died. 3 United Nations Security Council resolutions condemning Syria have been vetoed by Russia and China, but usually by Russia. Russia has said it will veto any other further UN resolutions. And then President Obama, who's not been incredibly speedy to act, said there was a red line. The red line was the use of chemical weapons, and on August the 21st, that red line was breached in the most dramatic way, and 1,500 people or so lost their lives. And we know it. And yet, the position that we ended up in the British Parliament was that we couldn't agree about doing anything about it. We couldn't agree to support America if it did anything about it, and so on. And insofar as the Syrians are now saying that they are now prepared to join the Chemical Weapons Convention and disarm of their chemical weapons, that has only been in response to the threat of military action of which this country was not prepared to be a partner.
So Parliament should have ignored, an MP should have ignored what appears to be the will of the British people?
Yes. It's one of the things that Parliament is for, is to make decisions about such matters.
Caroline Lucas.
Persuade people.
Well, I think it's a great shame that global responsibility gets defined solely in terms of military engagement. You know, I think we have global responsibility, but the idea that that only means lobbing cruise missiles over from one end of the world to the other, to my mind, doesn't stack up. I mean, absolutely, just like everybody here, everybody around the country would have deplored the use of chemical weapons. That goes, I hope, without saying. The images that we saw were etched on our minds. But I think the question in front of Parliament, in a sense, and in front of all of us was, do we have any evidence that a military response will make matters better? Or is there a very real risk that it could escalate issues further?
So it was a practical matter, not an issue of principle for you?
Well, in a sense, it was two things. I mean, if someone could have persuaded me that we could have ended all of the suffering and we wouldn't have had a massive backlash and we could have stopped the use of chemical weapons and stopped the violence in the Middle East through doing that, that would be quite a compelling argument. But none of those things seem to be the case. To the contrary, I think there was a lot of evidence coming as well from quite distinguished military people saying that this area is a powder keg, that the idea of putting a missile or set of missiles there and not knowing what the impact would be could actually make things an awful lot worse. And I hope that if we've learned anything over the last 10 or 20 years from Iraq and Afghanistan, it is that a military response, firing off missiles, as I say, to the Middle East, often doesn't bring about the peace that we might hope it would.
Man up there at the back.
Has a country like Australia shirked international responsibility, or Canada, Germany, Sweden, all good liberal countries, but they don't feel the need to, as Caroline was saying, send bombs into a Middle Eastern country? I think we've done our bit in the United Nations Security Council, and we should respect international law, because that respect for international law may save more lives going far into the future.
Yeah, Justine Greening, do you agree with that?
Well, I think the reason why the Prime Minister and the United States wanted to take military action was because international law had been broken. There's a long-standing law on chemical weapons, and Assad had breached that brutally. But at the end of the day, we're a democracy. We had a debate in Parliament. Parliament expressed its will, and ultimately, that's the most important thing. We as a government respect that, so we won't be part of that military action.
Parliament expressed its will except for you, because you didn't vote.
That's right. I'm not going to dress it up into anything that it's not. I went to Parliament fully intending to vote. I didn't vote. I'm gutted that I didn't get a chance to vote, but that's it.
It wasn't a deliberate mistake.
No.
But what about the issue of principle, then, which is what David Aaronovitch and Caroline Lucas were talking about? Do you believe that we should have done it yourself, even though the public think not, or Parliament thought not?
I believe we should.
Was the Prime Minister right?
The Prime Minister was right. There was an international law that was breached. We can't just turn a blind eye to that. And I don't think you would have seen the steps now possibly being taken by Syria around being prepared to put their chemical weapons out of harm's way if we hadn't upped the ante in the way that we did.
Can I just come back on that? Because the issue, when we were first recalled from recess, everybody expected, and indeed all of the reporting was, that the motion in front of us would have been about taking military action very, very quickly. Right. So there would have been no time for this diplomatic space that has been allowed to open up. So the rewriting of history that's going on, absolutely, I think, by the Conservative Party needs to be absolutely called out, because this was not a threat of military action to happen after leaving a space of time. It was a military action to happen pretty soon, which was why we were recalled from Parliament in order to come back and do it.
I'm sorry, Karen, there's a fantasy at the back of this, which is the idea that somehow or other Assad has said that he will get rid of his chemical weapons as a response to your not taking a vote in the House of Commons. It's an absolute fantasy.
But if we had taken that vote...
Hold on a second, let me just finish. If the Parliament, and after all, the resolution that was actually in front of the Commons actually was a waiting resolution on the production of evidence. At that point, you might very well then have had the Russian initiative about chemical weapons then and there if they were serious about it. What you seem to be suggesting, in fact, actually, in a funny way, is that, in fact, the Russians and the Syrians are not serious about it. That's essentially, in essence, the implication of what you're saying.
Chuka Umunna.
But Caroline's absolutely right about there being a rewriting of history, because we were being asked to sanction military action, basically a blank cheque to take military action, which everybody knows was planned for the weekend after the Thursday vote. And that military action was going to happen in advance of Assad agreeing to do anything that we are seeing him agreeing to do this week.
That wasn't the motion you had in front of you.
We were basically
There was going to be one on the following Tuesday.
We were being asked to go along and sanction military action
no, we weren't.
in
That's
advance.
Not true,
in advance, if you let me finish my sentence, in advance of us being provided with any legal basis for the for military action proceeding, in advance of the weapons inspectors, never mind reporting actually even leaving Syria, in advance of the US producing their intelligence evidence. Now, I think the issue here, and we have learnt, I suppose, from history here, is that before you act, you must make sure you actually understand the evidence and that you go through a proper process and you exhaust at least the process at the UN. That had not happened at the point that we were being asked to sanction military action.
Let me just say one thing.
Hold on, let's not stick with the parliamentary. To go back to the question that the questioner asked, have we shirked our global responsibility in not acting in a military way?
No, I don't think.
Do you think we should in certain circumstances?
I don't think we had, because I think if you look at the events of the last week, we have seen a potential solution put on the table which does not involve military action. Now, it's not just an issue of the ongoing horrendous death and destruction that we are seeing. I mean, obviously, it goes without saying, as Caroline said, that the use of chemical weapons is completely and utterly inexcusable. But we've got a mass humanitarian crisis here. We've got over 2 million people displaced, and bombs are not going to necessarily solve that issue.
So, in a sense, you admire what the Russian president's doing. That's your policy. That would have been your ideal way of dealing with it.
I don't think it's a question of admiring anybody. I think it's a question of how do we reach a democratic, political and sustainable solution to this ongoing civil war.
Let me bring
it's about
Colleen
stopping
Graffy.
other people being victims of chemical weapons.
Of course it is. That goes without saying. I don't think there's any disagreement.
No, it doesn't go without saying.
There's no disagreement on this panel about
Colleen Graffy.
Let me
and I've got a lot of people with their hands up, and I'll come to you all in a minute.
Let me pull it back a little bit, talking about global responsibility. Our starting point is that it's the United Nations Security Council that's supposed to identify threats to peace and then do something about it. And the problem is that we're good at identifying threats to peace, and we're not very good about doing something about it. And we look back at history, and we see when Mussolini invaded Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, the League of Nations voted 54-0 that this was contrary to our peace and security, but they didn't have the political will to do something about it. And what we're faced with now is Russia and China not wanting to be part of the international community in identifying these threats to peace. 2 years ago, as David was pointing out, we've been trying to put through resolutions to the Security Council holding Syria to account, and it's not been possible. And unfortunately, Parliament aside, it's been this brinkmanship of a threat of use of force that has actually gotten Putin to put pressure on his ally Assad in order for them to say that they will be forthcoming with the chemical weapons that they said that they didn't have.
What do you make of that? Do you think that is a good move? Do you think that is a sound move? Was Obama right to say America wasn't the world's policeman? Because some people think America has been the world's policeman.
Neither David Cameron nor Obama have presented this very well. There's been a lot of missteps and a lot of miscommunication, but we are where we are. And if this is not a delaying tactic by Syria and the Russians, then it will be excellent to be able to find a way of getting hold of these chemical weapons, and most importantly, also having Syria sign the Chemical Weapons Convention, because then it will then hold them to account.
Okay, had precipitative action taken place, do you think we would have seen what we're seeing happen now happen?
Well, what we're seeing now happen wouldn't have happened unless we had that threat of use of force. I'm sorry to say, and it didn't have to be that way. Putin could have come in earlier on this.
You, sir, on the right.
Just the first point that was made about a red line being crossed with the use of chemical weapons. Was the red line not crossed the day the first innocent civilian died?
Without chemical weapons being used,
yes,
you mean?
Why is it okay to kill with bombs and
It's
guns?
not okay. It's just that contrary to international law, the chemical weapons use, I know it's hard to believe, but we try and humanize warfare, as odd as that sounds, and the chemical weapons is one of those threshold points that all countries can agree on.
Okay. The man there with the red pullover on, you, sir.
This crisis has been going on for such a long time, and the 100,000 dead, as Aaron mentioned earlier. We're talking about red lines being crossed. The red line had been crossed ages ago, but it's just, is it just not about having a return on investment? I mean, what happened? We talk about learning from Iraq or learning from Libya. This just seems like they've been pondering for 2-3 years. Are we going to get anything out of it? And in terms of the UN and waiting for a UN resolution, I mean, Russia is already selling arms to the Bashar regime, and they have a financial interest in this. And it seems like slowly trickling money into the rebels. That's prolonging this rather than ever taking this to an end.
But what is your view that America, France, Britain should have intervened militarily?
Yeah,
or
I mean, I'm a Muslim myself, and I think the West should intervene at this stage. They intervened in Libya a couple of months in the uprising. This has been going on for 2 years. Why are they not intervening now when we have so many people dying on both sides?
But, sir, there was...
Caroline Lucas.
I just want to come back to the issue of the idea that because we're not in favour of a military response, that means we're not doing anything. There are a huge number of things that we need to be doing. We need to be absolutely straining every sinew on the diplomatic front. We need to be giving more resources for refugees. And we also need a more consistent approach to foreign policy, because I can't help feeling a bit frustrated about some of the inconsistency here, because, you know, we haven't talked about the use of things like white phosphorus or depleted uranium. If you're on the other end of those, they are hideous as well. They were used very recently by the US, by Israel, and we're not condemning that nearly so loudly. So could we have some consistency?
You can often get a round of applause by a bit of whataboutery like that.
It's not whataboutery, it's about consistency and international law. And if you're not consistent, that is exactly what makes people so angry.
Chemical weapons are covered by a clear convention, and those are examples of them. But you said something. You said we should strain every diplomatic sinew.
Yes.
Tell me, which diplomatic sinew you think in the last 2.5 years we've left unstrained?
Well, it's interesting how in the last few weeks we have managed to get people around a table. The Russians now, because this is a double proxy war, so you've got the Russians of the US, you've got Iran and Saudi, and because we've now got a diplomatic space, which I come back to what Chuka said, I think it is because we didn't go down the road that Parliament was being persuaded to go down in the run-up to that parliamentary vote.
You think the Russians said, this is really interesting. What a lovely moment. The British have been so nice in delaying any vote and not doing anything. We think this is the appropriate moment as a result. I'm being ridiculous. I'm being ridiculous, Chuka, because that argument is ridiculous.
This would never.
David Aaronovitch, suppose you put your cards on the table. What would your policy?
I was in favour of implementing a no-fly zone on the area and border areas of Syria back in 2011 in order to strengthen the pro-democracy rebels, because we could see that what would happen if you didn't was that arms, weapons and strengthening would happen to the Islamist rebels in Syria.
And how would that affect the use of chemical weapons? It wouldn't, you wouldn't have prevented that by those
No, it might not have prevented it.
And what
it might indeed not have prevented it, but I think in order to enforce a no-fly zone, it probably would have been necessary to take out Assad's air force, and then therefore some of the ability to dispatch...
And what would you want to see happen now? What would you have liked to have seen happen last week?
I would like to see a punishment of Assad's military significant enough to tell anybody else who wants to use chemical weapons, and he himself, in the future, that is what they would face if they did.
You wouldn't wait for international law before you did that. You wouldn't wait for the UN.
It is legal.
It is not legal. The responsibility to protect still requires a UN Security Council agreement. We don't have that.
Let me go to some members of the audience. The man there, you say, yes.
I was in the public gallery on the day of the vote, and I listened to MPs like Caroline for 5 hours. Then I watched the news post the vote, and I couldn't really understand why David Cameron had come out and said what he'd said. It wasn't really the mood of the House. The mood of the House was, we need time. No one had taken military options off the table. The Labour Party, Caroline and others were just calling for space. Exactly. Whether it's through luck, I think it has been partly through luck, with Putin and Obama acting subsequent to that. The diplomatic space has been allowed, and other channels have been explored, the Iranians amongst them. And I think that although the policy in the first instance may not have been the correct one, it was David Cameron's response which I found very odd, because he put it off the table. No one in that House had put it off the table completely, including the most anti-war of the MPs in there, Caroline included.
OK, why did David Cameron say the issue is now a dead issue?
The motion was all about giving a bit of space. It wasn't a motion about immediately taking military action. The reason we can't get involved in military action is because Parliament didn't even vote to give us a space to keep that option on the table.
What he's saying is that you didn't have to have the Prime Minister saying, I get it, and that's it.
Because
he could go back to Parliament.
Chuka's party would have voted against it. That's why he couldn't come back with it. Yes, you would.
Before we come to Chuka's party, let's just deal with David Cameron's party. Are you saying there's no circumstance in which the Prime Minister could go back to the House of Commons now, despite a vote, and say, situation's changed, or I now feel it's very important that we do take military action? Are you saying that is politically impossible for him to do?
I think what we said, unless circumstances dramatically change, Parliament has had its debate on this motion and basically said that military action cannot be pursued in relation to this chemical weapons attack, so we can't be part of that.
Go on, do you want to come back on this point?
They only said that based on the evidence before the House on the day. Absolutely. They didn't say that if things got perpetually worse and if more evidence was given, hard evidence, and there was more international support for it, not international support, just your friends, I mean UN General Assembly support, I think members on all sides of the House, the mood in the House that day was, if it got to it, we would do it.
All right.
But it had not got there yet.
Yeah, go on then.
But had that vote been passed, the government would have had to come back to Parliament with the sort of information, additional information and proposal, before it actually had got the ability to take any military action. This was all about saying, in principle, can we consider this? What Parliament said was no. And that's why this option has come off the table.
What Parliament said was provide us with the evidence, provide us with the legal basis, and tell us what the plan and the consequences are of the action. No, you didn't.
That was your first position.
We were not provided with that.
That was your first position.
We gave the Attorney General's summary of his own.
I tell you, David, that was our position throughout.
It wasn't your subsequent. No, it wasn't your subsequent position. And what Cameron was facing, however badly he might have handled it, and I agree with Colleen about this, was a situation whereby the Labour Party would almost certainly have voted against any further resolution he brought, and he knew it, and he knew that at least 30 of his backbenchers were unreliable as well, and that he would lose a second vote.
You would vote for it?
We were very clear that we would consider military action if a certain number of criteria were met. That was that we'd be given the legal basis, that was that we'd be given the evidence, and that was that we'd be given the plan after any action, and we were not provided with those things, and that's why we didn't consider military action at that point.
At this stage now, would you vote for it? Because we know that he's used
I've been asked this before. Look, if the Prime Minister wanted to bring the issue back to the House of Commons as a responsible opposition, which has a constitutional duty to scrutinise what the government does, of course we would have to consider
Do you take any account of what President Obama wants and what would happen in Congress, or does that not influence you in this?
Look, our number one concern here has been, will what we are being asked to do improve the situation of the Syrian people or not? And what is in the British national interest? Other considerations...
What do you call the British national interest?
Well, for example, I mean, I'm not going to... let me not get into hypotheticals, but of course we've got to think what is in our national interest. Is it in our national interest to act here? But most importantly, we've all been utterly shocked by what we've seen on the television.
Yeah, but is it in our national interest...
is that going to improve the situation?
Do you think it's in our national interest to support President Obama if he gets approval from Congress?
Well, look, it's not a question of whether we support President Obama or not. It's about doing the right thing.
All right, the woman on the right here.
So we're talking about an international law being breached when it comes down to chemical weapons. Have you forgotten that it was the UK which supplied Assad with chemicals from 2004 to 2010? Those are the chemical weapons which could have possibly been used against the Syrian people.
But what is the consequence of believing that to be true?
I didn't make it up.
But if it's true, how does it affect things?
How does it affect things? It was the UK which supplied. It was the UK which supplied Assad with chemical weapons, and that was a breach at its time.
That's incorrect, because it's not chemical weapons. There were chemicals.
But at the time, that was a breach. It was a breach at the time.
You sit on the left here.
And the government did own up to it, and they did say.
You, sir.
We've been sitting on our hands for 2 years now. A red line has been crossed. We're still debating party politics. It's clear that the UN doesn't work. The time for action is now.
OK. All right. You, sir, in the centre there.
What part is the United Nations now to play? We're saying that they're redundant, they don't seem to be able to deliver anything at all, so we're talking about avoiding them and going around them and declaring war ourselves on another nation. A fundamental part of the United Nations is you shouldn't seek change in governments purely for its own sake.
Can I come back onto that? Because I absolutely agree that I think one of the lessons for this whole episode is that the UN does need massive reform. The idea that you have 5 permanent members is like something out of Animal Farm, that some countries are more equal than others, and it doesn't work. There are mechanisms within the UN, like the United for Peace 1950 Act, which is something that means that if you had 2/3 of the general membership of the UN agreeing to something, even if it were military force, that could happen. So what we need to do is to look at the mechanisms that are still there at the UN, reform the parts that need to be reformed.
Perhaps we shouldn't forget Winston Churchill's great comment of George or not war, war.
Absolutely. We could also ask the US, though, to join the International Criminal Court. They haven't actually signed up to the ICC, which would make a start.
I don't want to leave this topic, but I want to just go to a slightly different aspect of it. Bushra Al-Akra has a question, which I'd like to take, please.
Is asking Assad to hand over chemical weapons an invite for him to kill more using conventional weapons?
In other words, this focus on chemical weapons solely. David Aaronovitch, what do you think?
Well, yes.
Allows him, in effect, to...
Yes.
Nobody's talking about the conventional weapons.
The vast majority of the 100,000 people killed in Syria weren't killed by chemical weapons. There are various reasons why that was decreed to be a red line. But your point is absolutely right. We could have a situation whereby, for his own purposes, Assad strings out the business of the chemical weapons business, but we know what will actually be going on all the time while that's happening, which is that his army and his air force will continue to flatten rebel-held areas and any areas which don't accede to him. That's what we know. That is what's going to happen anyway. You're right.
Colleen Graffy, do you agree with that?
Yes, but the problem, I mean, first of all, getting these chemical weapons will be incredibly important, and it might be that what has to take place will be somewhat of a ceasefire. Maybe there can be some coming around to the table. But the difficulty is how do you have a regime change? And what is going to come in its place? And do we know who are the moderate rebels that we can support? And the right to protect is still an international law that is evolving. And so I think that's our problem, is we feel absolutely frustrated at not being able to do anything, but intervening in a civil war is going to be problematic. But it doesn't mean that we cannot find and identify those moderate Syrians who want a secular state. And I think we're kidding ourselves to say that it's impossible to do. I think we can. Okay,
the man in the middle with spectacles, and then I come to you up there on the left. Yes.
Every major NGO is saying don't enter with troops on the ground. I work for Oxfam. That's the main thing that we're saying at the moment. By the way, it's not 2 million displaced, it's 5 million. I think it's really important that the UN needs to, as the lady mentioned earlier, that the mechanisms in place in the UN need to be reformed, because what happened last time in Iraq, Britain and America just went round. They were walking too slowly. And, you know, as everyone has mentioned, it's 2 years later.
What would you do now? You can't sit around talking about reforming the UN at this stage.
No, obviously, no. I just shoulda, coulda, woulda, I guess, comes to mind. But no one's asked him to step down. No one's told them, you know, you must stop. Both sides must stop now, or we will enter. I stand between, you know, in the middle. From my perspective, working for a charity, I don't want people to be hurt. But the decisions that people will make to go in it isn't to do with me, it's to do with governments.
One more point from you, sir, in the blue shirt. I'll come to you if I can, too. Yes.
I suspect we should give some credit to Russia in the sense that they've actually come up with a solution, at least even if it's a starting point. And I don't know for certain, but I suspect that, almost to go back to what an earlier question was talking about, I suspect that we haven't really engaged with Russia and with China diplomatically. And I think there's a great deal of...
I don't think that's true. This is the first conflict since Vietnam where we've not even been able to get a Security Council resolution on the humanitarian access that's required to help the 2 million refugees and the 4 to 5 million people who are displaced within Syria. On Rwanda, Kosovo, we were able to get agreement to at least have civilians protected and taken out of harm's way, to have doctors agree that doctors would not be targeted. We have not been able to get a resolution on that. Why? Because the Russians have stood in the way of that, and China. So let's not have rose-tinted glasses about the Russians now that they are choosing to possibly engage politically. They could have done this months ago, and in fact, if they had, maybe we wouldn't be in the situation where chemical weapons had been used by Assad in the first place. And we now need to, you're absolutely right, focus on the politics of this, because ultimately it's going to be a diplomatic solution that solves this civil war. But in the meantime, we surely need to put pressure on Russia and China to at least allow humanitarian access and to, I would say, become a much bigger part of providing the money that we need to help support the millions of people who've been affected by this crisis.
Right.
About 3 million of them now children.
Okay. You've had your hand up since the beginning of this. I take pity on you, so a last point from you, sir. Yeah.
All right. In 2011, the Libyan civil war began on February. The same war ended in October/November with the death of Colonel Gaddafi. It ended within span of maybe 10 or 11 months. Every single country condemned the actions of Gaddafi. They all supported the rebels. They all bombed and targeted Gaddafi.
Come to Syria.
Why is it that the same response, the same actions, the same level of military support is not being provided to the rebels?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll leave that unless anybody wants quickly to reply. It's a different country and
we were able to get a UN Security Council resolution through, and China and Russia abstained. And now, because they saw a regime change take place, that is why they're specifically going to veto anything to do with Syria, because they don't want to see a regime change there, because Putin, of course, has $1 billion worth of weapons trade with Syria and a big investment in their energy sector. I'm
going to move on to another question now, because we've spoken for half the programme about Syria, and very sensibly too. As you know, of course, you can join in this debate by text or Twitter. Our hashtag, just a reminder, is BBCQT, and you can follow us at BBC Question Time. If you're texting, 83981 is the number to text. The red button will reveal what others are texting. A question now, domestic. Lewis Kershaw, back home, please. Lewis Kershaw.
Given that 70% of the public oppose it, should the government privatise the Royal Mail?
All right. The proposal to privatise the Royal Mail within weeks. Chuka Umunna.
They shouldn't privatise the Royal Mail, and I'll tell you why. The Royal Mail is actually doing very well at the moment. It is just announced over the last year over £400 million operating profit. And what the government is doing, and the government, by the way, has taken on the historic pension liabilities of the Royal Mail, so it's nationalised the debt, if you like, and now it's privatising the profit at the very time that it's beginning to be a really successful business in public ownership. That makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever.
So you're the business secretary. You're the business secretary. If Labour were to win the election, you'd reverse the decision.
Well, I wouldn't be doing what they're doing now. Now, the
problem
problem
would you reverse what they're going to do?
Just a moment.
Not just a moment. Would you reverse
I'm trying to
decision?
answer the question.
Okay, answer.
And we don't know how much they're actually going to raise from the sale, which has been announced today. And therefore, we also have absolutely no idea how much it would cost to buy it back after it is sold. So, in a way, saying, will you renationalise it now, is asking for me to write a blank cheque, and I'm not prepared to do that.
Don't you get the revenue from tax and corporation tax but from a successful business? Well, why does it need to be owned by the state? I mean, if you use the same argument, you'd start nationalising successful businesses.
Well, let me give you two really good reasons. The Post Office provides Royal Mail services. It's a very important relationship the two have. There's an agreement between the two. It helps maintain the viability of the Post Office. Now, in the short term, that agreement is secure. In the long term, there's absolutely no guarantee that Royal Mail will continue to provide services through the Post Office. And secondly, just think about it. Your local Royal Mail delivery and sorting offices, they're in prime locations. What is to stop a privatised Royal Mail not just selling off all of these assets to realise a profit, and meanwhile, you as consumers or small business people are going to have to travel so much further? And I tell you the other thing about this, David, it's been presented as this big opportunity for the public to buy into the Royal Mail. The minimum stake that you will have to invest to be able to buy a share as a member of the public is £750. Now, look, if you're in the cabinet earning a big sum of money, that might not seem that much. But I think to most people, my constituents in Streatham, that is just out of the question for them.
You've got a holiday home in Ibiza and £1 million house.
But I have, well, actually, I mean, if I will say so, let me get back to that. As Justine may have seen, my family has property in another country. Frankly, I think we should probably keep our families out of politics and stick on the issues, Justine.
Justine Greening.
I think this is about allowing the Royal Mail to be able to compete in what is a really tough and changing global market, ultimately. It needs freedom. It needs freedom to innovate, freedom to get more investment in, and frankly, it needs freedom from politicians interfering day to day. Does that mean we should allow it to do whatever it likes in the future? No, which is why for the first time we've legislated to make sure there will be that universal postal provision that we all rely on. And as Chuka has said, admitted, the Royal Mail has done a long-term deal with the Post Office, and actually it's inconceivable that those two organisations won't work closely together, because it's in both of their interests. And Chuka talked about how the Royal Mail may change. Ultimately, successful businesses have to meet customer needs. This is about allowing the Royal Mail to be in a position to do that, and ultimately it's going to be a public listed company, so the whole public can invest in it.
Can I ask you a very naive question? What is it can't do at the moment, and that presumably your government is preventing it doing, that you feel it should be freed to do?
It needs to get more investment if it's going to compete, and ultimately that can come from pretty much two different places. One, it can come from the taxpayer, and that may be several £billion that we can't put into schools or hospitals, or it can come from the markets and shareholders. And actually what we're saying is we think this is
profits. Why not reinvest the profits it's making now, Justine?
And we all know a few years ago it wasn't making profit.
But it's doing very well. It's doing very well. Actually, thanks to good management. And I don't think... I mean, you're saying, no, there's a risk of political interference. Are you saying that you and the Cabinet are massively interfering in Royal Mail right now?
I think what I'm saying is that the Labour Party in 2009 fully supported privatisation, and now you've changed your mind.
No,
so,
look,
frankly, there isn't that consistency of approach.
We never proposed in government to put a majority stake into private ownership. We were always going to maintain a majority stake. You're selling off this whole 300-year-old institution that we all love, which was one of those things that helps bind us together. Everybody knows their local postie. You're selling that off for the sake of making a quick buck so that you can basically fill a hole in the public finances caused by the lack of growth. That's what this is about.
In the third row from the back, two in, yes.
The way I see it, the way I understand it, the way the postal service works is that no matter where you live in the country, you pay the same amount for postage. Like, you can live in the north or the south, you pay the same amount. If you privatise it now, there are certain areas, certain rural areas, which would not get a much frequent delivery service, because that's not going to be very, in terms of commercialism, it's not going to work. Just not make much profit from that. And as it stands now, the Royal Mail owns a duty to the public. If it becomes privatised, it owes duty to the shareholders. So already the dynamics are going to change, and if profit becomes the main objective, then no way the service.
You don't believe the assurances the government gives that it's all...
We've actually legislated to make sure that that provision you just talked about, which does matter, stays. So by law, the Royal Mail will have to continue providing that. That will be regulated by Ofcom.
Until 2015.
No.
Until 2015, Justine.
That's just wrong.
It is true. The universal service obligation is up for review in 2015. So will you guarantee, therefore, now that beyond 2015 it will stay the same? Will you do that?
I will, and it has to be changed. If you can change it by law if you want to. We're not going to. This is now enshrined in...
to keep the universal service obligation the same.
If you'll let me finish, Chuka. This is now enshrined in legislation that the kind of service you talked about will be continued to be provided, this universal postage service that we all rely on.
Colleen.
It's in legislation. Only Parliament can change it through law.
Colleen Graffy.
Well, I remember Margaret Thatcher wanting to privatise, but not the Royal Mail. But that was before the internet, before internet shopping, before we had FedEx, before we had UPS. And the fact is that times have changed. And in order for the Royal Mail to keep on top of that, it needs a big influx of capital. It needs access to the equity markets. And if it borrows now, for every pound it borrows a pound on the national debt. And so to privatize Royal Mail, it's just, unfortunately, this is the way things need to happen. And you just, frankly, America will follow suit.
Why do you say unfortunately? You prefer
well, because there is that sentimental tie to it. But the reality is, look at the U.S. Postal Service. It's $16 billion in debt. They can't afford to buy vans or trucks. They're having to lease them.
But
it's not sustainable.
It's doing pretty well. It's making profit. It's making profit because it's actually delivering lots of those things that people order online.
It's not going to be enough to keep up with the competition.
Okay,
Times have
the woman
changed.
at the back there, the very back with red hair.
I just think it's very sad, yes, that we are losing a great British institution. I wonder how many we have left, you know, what it is that
BBC,
we have about our identity. And it's sad because I think a lot of people, myself included, have already started using other courier services to deliver parcels and packages. My local post office and I live in a large area of London, is the smallest part of a building now, and you can't even tell it's a post office on the outside. We're losing all these identities. It's very sad.
David Aaronovitch.
I don't really much mind.
Well, that's a lot of good.
No, but it's actually...
You have nothing to say
I was thinking in parts of this discussion that it sort of seemed to take me back 20 years to the nationalisation of British Telecom. The first thing to say to Chuka is, of course, yes, Peter Mandelson, when he was accepting government, wanted to do 49%. But he would have gone on to do most of the rest, actually. And if this government hadn't done it, I think that had you come to power, or if you did come to power in 2015, after a couple of years, you'd do it too, because you'd be faced off with a similar sort of problem, which is that although the Royal Mail bit's doing well, the parcels bit is incredibly undercapitalised and is actually having to do is very significantly competed.
Do you accept Justine Greening's argument that in order to get the capital, or what Colleen was saying, to get the capital, you've got to be able to go to the market?
It makes sense, doesn't it? Because it's certainly been the case with other industries that actually you can raise more capital if you're a private... I mean, the big question for us as the users is what guarantees there are that the service will be as good as it was before. Now, this is not only locked in by an Act of Parliament, but what people aren't also saying is it's also locked in by bits of European legislation as well about the levels of service that have to be provided across by Europe. So I'm relatively happy that it will be OK.
OK. You, sir, with the striped tie on.
It just seems like Chuka's saying, it seems like a total conflict in timing. I mean, we do one thing right, make £400 million, then we trip ourselves up trying to privatise something that's making money. Can't we just, sit back with the profit, let it run with the changes that seem to have happened, and then kind of take a check of things and think, well, actually, this is making some money. The capital issue might answer my question, but it seems like the government makes money for itself and then says, right, well, we'll do something else, we'll trip ourselves up.
Caroline Lucas, is that...
Well, I agree with that, and I want to see any future profits from the Royal Mail invested in the service not being siphoned off to private shareholders. I also think that if you're looking for capital to put into it, then actually the government can borrow at the lowest levels at the moment, so if that's what you want to do, you could do that.
8%.
I think that what you're also likely to see is more job losses, but what really worries me, actually, is the link to the post office, because I am not reassured by any of the language I've heard from this government that somehow that link between Royal Mail and the post office is absolutely secure and it would be unthinkable for it to be separated. We might have sat here a few years ago and thought that it would be unthinkable for the NHS to be privatised, or that that element of providing a public service in the NHS would have been under threat. And we've seen what's happened. So I'm really worried about what will happen to our post offices, because post offices actually aren't just places where you buy your stamps or whatever. They are part of the glue that holds communities together. And they are places one of the few places where people can still meet each other, know each other, and adds something to our society. And the real threat, if these policies go ahead, I don't believe your protections. I absolutely don't.
Actually, they're not talking about the post offices, remember?
But
they're talking about the Royal Mail.
Of course, we're talking about the Royal Mail. But
you made the point for me, I forgot to mention that you're going to be able to borrow money cheaper outside than you can inside the government. So Royal Mail is going to be able to save money by borrowing outside
and we protect
within the government.
Post office network. It was the last government that shut down post offices. I lost loads in my constituency. Chuka knows that. We've protected the post office network, and in fact we've invested in it to make it even better.
The post office is safe under either of your hands.
Also,
I don't think Labour was pretty good at the post offices either.
On which happy note, we go on to another question. Danielle Sherman, please. Danielle Sherman.
In the light of Michael Lavelle's acquittal, should those accused of sexual crimes be granted the same anonymity as their accusers?
And you're a lawyer yourself, aren't
Yes.
you? Before I go to the panel, do you have a view on this?
I think that the impact of being accused of that sort of crime is so much greater than any other crime, really, that it's something that we need to seriously consider, yes.
That you might, because the Coronation Street actor, of course, had massive publicity about this charge that he had repeatedly raped a child. Should he be granted anonymity as his accuser was? David Aaronovitch.
No, I don't think he should. But I can see why people argue about this and think it's a matter of some kind of fairness that because his accuser has anonymity in sexual cases and cases of rape, therefore the person who is accused should have anonymity. Unfortunately, what you're planning to do, if we should suggest that, is that you give this one category of offence an anonymity that no other offence gets, not even murder. Which is, after all, a fairly personal and intimate crime. And the second consequence of that is that when somebody... It would mean that have to be anonymous at the point where they were charged or accused. One of the things that quite often happens in rape cases and so on is that you will find that you have a serial rapist, somebody who's raped before. And so when the accusation is made, other cases can quite often come forward which wouldn't otherwise come forward and act therefore as corroboration for what is very often a he against she, his word against her word.
In a case like this, of course, that didn't happen.
No, in the case like this it didn't happen, but in any other cases...
And yet the opprobrium attached to him...
Well, that's one of the things we have
one of the
things we have to rethink is how much opprobrium we attach to people at the point where they are accused of something, as opposed to the point where they're either convicted.
Colleen Graffy, you're a professor of law. What do you think?
I'm also a member of the English bars, and I appreciate the work that the Crown Prosecution Service does, and it looks like they clearly thought that they had the evidence on this one. But the problem with allowing that individual to have anonymity is that so often the strengthening of the case comes about when the person has been named, and you see his face and you hear the stories, just like in the Jimmy Savile case. You know, this is where we had other individuals coming to light to say that they also had had an incident take place. So I think we couldn't have anonymity.
Okay. Do any of you think there should be anonymity? Justine Greening, do you?
I think there's an earlier stage of the process when the police are investigating where there is anonymity and they can take a decision to waive that and make that investigation public, which is what happened in the case of Jimmy Savile, for example, or Stuart Hall, and that can then give people who've also been affected the confidence to come forward and actually help build the case. But my sense is that ultimately, as David says, you can't really you can't have anonymity once the charges have been brought. But I do think that we have a system where people are innocent until proven guilty, and I think perhaps that needs to be borne more in mind as these cases are tried through the courts.
There was an argument which we had on Question Time earlier in the year about whether there should be anonymity at the point of arrest and it should be retained if there was no charge, if there was no prosecution.
Well, at the moment, the police can have anonymity when people are arrested and it's only when they're charged that it becomes public.
But it's rare. Everybody seems to know who's arrested. The woman up there on the right.
Hello. I'm sorry, but this drives me absolutely up the wall. The Crown Prosecution Service estimates that 0.3% of accusations of rape are false, and we spend so much time discussing the consequences for the person that's been accused, how terrible it must be for them. Oh, all these old men feel it. It drives me absolutely up the wall. That is not the problem. That is not what we should be focusing on at all, and I really think something should be done to address the way we have this debate, because we are missing the point in a very big way.
And in your view, the point is?
Not that the problem is whether they look a bit bad. The problem is that it's very, very difficult to prosecute these cases. The Crown Prosecution Service is in a very difficult position of whether they choose to charge someone or not. And from my understanding, they have to have a very reasonable level of evidence before they do decide to charge someone.
Caroline Lucas.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy for what the lady up there just said, and I think it would be really unfortunate if one of the conclusions of all of this was that there's more doubt over the cases that are brought to court, because it's incredibly difficult to secure convictions on rape cases anyway. There's also difficulty in getting people to come to court. So when we consider, you know, just that the level of rape cases that are actually being properly tried and so forth, it's a fraction of the number of rapes that are happening. So we shouldn't be discouraging women from coming forward. We need to be focusing on being able to ensure that they do get good justice. So I don't disagree with anything that anyone said around the table, but I would also add to what Justine was saying, that I think the media has a bit of a role here, because you get trial by, you know, the Daily Mail or the Daily Mirror or whatever, as well as by the jury, and it's not surprising that, you know, people have an outcry when they see how somebody appears to have been tried in the media, even though they turn out to be innocent. So let's sort that out.
Right.
But I don't think the way to do it is by lifting anonymity.
And let's go on to a last question for this evening from Fung Ma Wan, please.
Has George Osborne won the argument on the economy?
Ah, Has George Osborne won the argument on the economy? I wonder who I should go to first on this. Colleen Graffy.
Well, I think...
Observer of these things.
I think that he has. I think that, as he's put it, that the economy is turning a corner, and I think that Ed Miliband, well, actually Ed Ball's saying that the economy was going to flatline and keep flatlining. I think it's Ed Ball's career that's going to be flatlining, and we might see a reshuffle, wee bit of a reshuffle coming up. Perhaps some are saying Alistair Darling needs to get in there to freshen things up. So Labour got it wrong, Conservatives have got it right, and again, it was a deep recession, it was a long recession, and it's not going to happen overnight, but the signs are very good.
What was the argument that he won? Because we don't really know whether he did the right thing. We only know that the recession is very slowly receding.
His argument was that we have to tackle the austerity measures, that we can't be throwing money at it in order to make a change.
But you don't know whether he's right or wrong, do you?
Well, the concern was that the austerity measures were happening and we were feeling the pain, and frankly it was the British people and the sacrifices that they made. But were we seeing any results? And now we see 1.3 million back in jobs. We see the unemployment going down. These are really good indicators. Okay. Now you have headwinds that could be coming in from the weakness of the Eurozone, but if things stay on course, he's done the right thing.
So, Chuka Umunna, Mr. Balls is going to be out of a job.
No, I don't think this isn't about George Osborne or my friend Ed's careers. This is about people's lives. It's not a game. And the question that you have to ask is, how do people actually feel? I'm pleased to see encouraging data, but we know that it's still quite a mixed picture. I mean, if you look in my constituency in Streatham, in Justine's in Putney, we've seen in both of our constituencies long-term unemployment increase 5 times since the general election. Most people, on average, have sustained a £1,500 pay cut since May 2010. And I think if you ask most people, do you feel better off now or worse off now compared to 2010? People don't feel better off. So there is certainly no cause for anyone to celebrate.
But hang on.
The issue is,
wait a minute. Ed Balls said that Osborne's plan clearly hadn't worked. Do you agree with that? Do you agree that it clearly hasn't worked? In other words, there's need for a plan B, which Labour's been
I do believe that George Osborne's plan hasn't worked because, look, we're talking about this data after 3 years of a flatlining economy. I don't think that is a cause for celebration. I don't think that is a the fact that finally we're coming out and we're seeing a recovery beginning to take hold again, I don't think this means that he's been vindicated at all. We've had to wait 3 years for this. And the question, David, is what are you doing to actually relieve the squeeze on middle and lower income families? Now, I don't think giving a £100,000 tax cut to people who are doing very well, earning millions of pounds, at the same time that you're cutting VAT, you're cutting working tax credit and making life harder for most families in this country is the way to go when we've got this huge cost of living crisis.
All right.
I've got to agree with Chuka. A recovery based solely on artificially inflated house prices is hardly a recovery to be proud of.
No,
I
agree. I agree.
Looking at working people where I live in East London, seeing a public sector pay freeze that is punishing them, rising food prices, rising house prices, making it almost impossible for them to make ends meet. If this is the best that he can do, then he needs to try a lot harder.
All right, Justine Greening. You want to answer his point?
I think we're seeing unemployment now lower than when this government came into power. Employment's at an all-time high. There have never been more women employed in the job market. We've seen businesses create 1.4 million jobs. Ed Ball said it was a fantasy that the private sector would create more jobs than were going to be lost in the public sector. It's created 3 times more jobs than have been lost in the public sector. We're now getting growth back into the economy. The economy is now turning the corner, and we're on the right track, ultimately. And the argument that's been won by George Osborne is to totally torpedo Labour's strategy, which is that you borrow your way out of a debt crisis. And the only answer they have to problems in our economy is spend, spend, spend. They want more spending, more borrowing, more debt, and the British people have made huge sacrifices to take these steps we've done. No, let me finish. To take the steps tough choices we made to now reduce the deficit by a third. And in a year and a half, we'll all have the choice about where we want to go next with our country, and we should not turn the clock back and make the same mistakes that we had before.
Hold on, Caroline. I want to come to a member of the audience. The man with the spectacles there, in the second row from the back, you, sir. And I'll come to you, Caroline.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm a public sector worker, and I'm also part of an endangered species, a public sector trade unionist. And frankly, my colleagues at work at a council in North London have actually paid the price for this so-called recovery. Absolutely. Over the last 4 years in our council, we've seen more than 630 redundancies, most of them compulsory. We have seen, actually, a dramatic erosion in living standards. Yeah. My real pay has gone down by some 15%. My wife is a teacher of the deaf in East London. She has seen her real pay go down and her pension contributions go up.
All right,
at the same time that we're seeing an upward redistribution of wealth in this society. Right. Recovery for whom?
Caroline, I'll come back to you, because I suspect you'll agree with much of what he said. Let me go to David Aaronovitch, and then I'll come back to you, Caroline.
I don't think there's any vindication of George Osborne in what has been an incredibly slow and almost inevitable recovery after the crash of 2008. Of course, we've got some element of recovery. What's imponderable is whether or not the relatively small policy difference that Labour has with what the government's done in overall terms would have made any great difference or not. And that's the imponderable. I can't say whether it would or whether it wouldn't. Somebody said to me the other day, I've read a lot of what you write, but you don't write about the economy. And that, I said, is because I don't know who's right about the economy. I don't know whether this economist or that economist, whether it's true that we would have been like Greece if we'd borrowed a little bit more, or whether we'd suddenly become like China if we managed to pay back our debt a little bit quicker.
Is this because you're ignorant or because it's unknowable?
No, it's both. It's both. I am a bit ignorant, but it is also, as far as I can tell, relatively unknown. So people occupy these great entrenched positions, political positions, and actually, for the rest of us, we just try and have to guess who's right about it, and usually we get it wrong.
Caroline Lucas.
Well, I do want to come back to the gentleman from the back there who was talking about the experience in his community of how it is essentially the poorest people who have paid the highest cost for getting us out of this deficit, to the extent that we're having a very small sign of recovery. And for the government to somehow pat themselves on the back when they have absolutely, suppressed recovery for so long by their draconian measures, and now we're supposed to be grateful to them that maybe there's a small change happening, I think is ludicrous. It's like Osborne crashing the car and then bringing the wreck back, and we're all supposed to be terribly grateful for him for doing it. We are not grateful, because essentially what's happened is that over the past few years, what I've seen in my constituency is a growth of food banks, is a growth of people on the zero contract hours, it's a growth of people who can't afford to send their kids to school with uniform and they're having to borrow for money to do that. I mean, it is an absolutely terrible situation.
You think Osborne crashed the car, do you?
I
think it was this government?
I think it was the response to that. There was an international there was an international banking crisis, and then what happened was that this government has made it 10 times worse.
No, we were living beyond our means.
We were not living beyond our means. This was a banking crisis.
That's what you call a structural deficit.
No,
living
it was
beyond
a
our means, spending more every year than the tax revenues we got in.
It was a crisis of banking, and this government made it 10 times worse. What we should be doing is investing in jobs. Jobs that have got people back into the economy and got it going.
And unemployment's falling.
I have to call time. I'm sorry, our hour's up. We're in Rochdale next week. We have Harriet Harman and Shirley Williams among those on the panel. And the week after that, we're going to be in Uxbridge. So either Rochdale or Uxbridge, take part, apply via our website. The address is there on the screen, or call 0330 123 9988. And if you've been listening to this on Radio 5 Live, you can call in now and continue the debate on Question Time, Extra Time with Steve Nolan and John Pienaar. My thanks to our panel, and in particular to all of you who came here tonight to take part in this programme. From Question Time, the first in the new run in London. Good night.